Hi there, I'm Patrick Larsimont, the author of several military World War II aviation thrillers and also a couple of paranormal stories. I'm here today with you down the Red Rabbit Hole as part of the 31 Days of Halloween collection. Today I'd like to talk to you about one of my books, which is called The Brookwood Boys, set in Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, England, and it was published on Halloween 2024, and I hope you enjoy my little stories. The novel tells the tale of Mouse Forsyth, who was a World War I soldier who has haunted Brookwood Cemetery for 100 years. Over that time, he's greeted the good, the bad, the mad and the sad, joining him over the years. And then one day, he is seen by a young boy, and potentially now can communicate with the living. Brookwood is the largest cemetery in the UK, set within the largest cemetery in Western Europe. In fact, it was once the largest in the world. Yes, and all of that hidden away in some quiet, leafy part of Surrey. It was actually created in the Victoria era and was variously known as the London Sepulchre or Necropolis. Since London cemeteries were becoming increasingly overcrowded, they were also then being dug up by large-scale civil engineering projects like building Paddington train station and the creation of Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system. It was decided that they should be moved somewhere else, not to mention Londoners' ancestors were also increasingly finding their way into the drinking water, so a solution really needed to be found. As ever practical, the Victorians decided that Brookwood was the solution, and to date, some 250,000 people have been buried, reburied, or are commemorated here. It also has the largest collection of giant redwoods, very imposing specimens in the country. The cemetery has had its own train station, and daily trains of death ferried the dearly departed and their mourners from London several times a day. A commuter train, if you will, for the capital's corpses. The military cemetery, where Mouse is buried in an unknown American soldier's grave from World War I. With him are many others from many nations, from both world wars, but also many conflicts since. There are soldiers, sailors, nurses, and many airmen, not just Allied forces, but also former enemies, Italians and Germans, and amongst the Allies are Canadians, Americans, Poles, Czechs, Belgians, French, Indians, South Africans, and many, many more. It's a huge site, often very quiet, with enormous trees and thousands of gravestones. It can be quite spooky, very foggy in the winter, swirling ghost-like mist between the gravestones, and cawing rookeries of crows in the trees, and the shriek of vixens in the rhododendrons. In fact, one of my ghosts, that of a World War I widow who hanged herself in her grief, was inspired by that shrieking call. I call her the Shrieker, and she exists as a fleeting wraith that flits through the trees, terrifying all who hear her. In the Victorian sections of the cemetery, the graves are often quite extravagant, accompanied by statues of people mourning, and sometimes can be quite strange and terrifying because they're worn away and broken down to component parts which loom out of the mist. They come in all shapes and sizes. There are mourning angels, weeping women, fierce snarling dragons, eagles with outstretched talons, and strangely disturbing to me, spooky little teddy bears and even sleeping little babies. I can't say I've actually seen any ghosts myself, but it is a very melancholic, deeply atmospheric place where man's folly against man is writ large across the silent acres. There's undoubtedly a presence there. No, I should probably say several. All of this I discovered actually quite by accident. Like many, I started writing during COVID lockdown, and Brookwood was a conveniently close place where I could go and walk, and there weren't too many people, well, apart from the spirits, of course. It occurred to me that these rows of gravestones, all laid out side by side, were actually characters in a story. Their own, of course, but also our collective history. I thought, in this place where so many people have been hurt, traumatized, and passed on, surely if ghosts did exist, they must surely be here. And what if I told their story? Digging into those stories, I discovered much more than I expected, and here are a few snippets that I've included in Brookwood Boys. I'll start gently with the grave of Hedwig Hattie Rathel, an American nurse who died in November of 1918 of Spanish flu, exactly when she would have been at her most useful. It is this professional frustration to explain why she remained here, or as the term I use in my book, tarried here at Brookwood. Many, many others died of influenza, and it's particularly poignant to see their gravestones all squished together as the death toll rose up so dramatically in 1918. Particularly as I looked around at the time and was particularly struck that our own world was going through COVID-19, our modern day influenza, and truth be told, it could have been so much worse like it was back in 1918. Elsewhere, In the RAF Airmen's plot, I discovered two 21-year-olds lying side by side. Both were killed within weeks of each other in 1940 during the Battle of Britain and were lost without a trace, something that was far more common than I expected. And so, in fact, were missing in action for many decades. John Ramsey was the first to be found and buried in 1983 here at Brookwood, 43 years after he was killed in action. Then 10 years later, Hugh the Cockney Sparrow Ellis was buried beside him, 55 years since he died. In the book, I used this as a coming home for them, and I pair it with a tale of Lieutenant Kurt Sidhow, a real fighter, German fighter ace who is also buried here. For the purposes of the story, I make him responsible for their deaths, and in time they make a strange, unlikely trio, a sort of war family within the tale. Not far from Sidhow's grave are the gravestones of several other Luftwaffe airmen, amongst them Oberleutnant Robert Zaber, the pilot of a Dornier bomber which allegedly targeted Buckingham Palace. His aircraft crashed near Victoria Station in London, and he landed wounded by parachute at Kennington, near the famous Oval Cricket Ground. Here he was set upon by a furious mob of EastEnders, reportedly mostly women, who beat him so severely that he died the next day and was subsequently buried in Brookwood. The terror he must have felt from the baying mob is also in my story. Right next to Zaber's gravestone are three more closely clustered together. I was intrigued to find out why and discovered that on the 4th of September 1940, the aircraft factories at Brooklands, the home of the pre-war racing circuit, were bombed. Two of the attackers were shot down, each aircraft with a crew of two. One parachuted to safety, but three didn't make it. You can only imagine the state of the bodies lying in the wreckage. But what I actually discovered subsequently was much more appalling than that. The bodies of the German airmen were severely looted by the Canadian infantry, which had been assigned to guard the wreckages. And this included the removal of many body parts. For weeks, months, and even years, in the local pubs and dance halls of Surrey, these macabre trophies were passed around and reportedly included a jawbone, a severed ear, and the top of a skull with a swastika scribbled on it in pencil. What was left of the airmen was then reputedly delivered to the cemetery by local police in a steel bucket in one case and a stinking jute bag containing a backbone and hips in another. This is why the gravestones are all clumped together, as it was undoubtedly difficult to distinguish which pieces belonged to whom. That's quite a thought when gazing down on some gravestones. Brookwood is a place that's full of conspiracy theories and hushed-up secrets. Take, for example, the mysterious Plot X, located somewhere in the cemetery, but no one knows exactly where. This was where the men of the US Armed Forces found guilty of murder or rape during World War II were buried in disgrace after being executed at Shepton Mallet Prison in Somerset. They were brought here in cloth mattress covers, and buried without any ceremony. Their stories are also intertwined in mine. In a sinister twist, two died by firing squad and 16 were hanged. But what is most telling, all bar one were African American, the sole exception being Hispanic. It is a shocking statistic which speaks volumes to the racial inequality which existed in the US Armed Forces at the time. After the war, all the remains were dug up and transferred to the American cemetery in Picardy, France. There they lie with 94 other executed prisoners, all for crimes committed during or shortly after World War II. Their victims include 26 fellow Americans, all of which were murdered, 71 British, French, German, Italian, Polish and Algerian civilians hurt or raped or murdered by their erstwhile allies. There is no flag flying over this plot, and the numbered graves have no headstones. Each body was buried with their back to the main cemetery, lying in what is termed as perpetual dishonour. Another cover-up linked with Brookwood is the location of the bodies from a disaster that occurred at Slapton Sands in Devon. During the run-up to D-Day, this coastline at Slapton was chosen for practice runs for the landings, as it closely resembled the Normandy beach, which came to be known as Utah. During Exercise Tiger, two disasters occurred, which made these rehearsals particularly deadly and costly to the Allies. On the night of the 22nd of April 1944, a convoy of ships due to disembark US troops the next day on Slapton Sands was attacked by German torpedo boats. Several vessels were sunk and there was heavy loss of life. Despite this, the exercise went ahead the next day, and through some miscommunication, the troops landing on the beach were not only fired by ship's artillery, but also by the troops pretending to be the Germans ashore. No one knows exactly how many were killed because of this mishap, but officially over 1,000 Americans were killed during Exercise Tiger. In a war-weary Britain, and just days before D-Day, it was felt that this news would be terrible, would have a terrible impact on the nation's morale, and as well, of course, the fighting troops' morale. So it was all hushed up. The bodies that were recovered, some are still out there in the sea somewhere, they were shipped out in the middle of the night to be buried at Brookwood. After the war, they too were dug up, some sent back to the United States, but many more buried in the American Military Cemetery in Cambridge. Where they were buried at Brookwood has since become the plots for Italian prisoners and the Free French, and in my story, of course, this has led to some interesting turf wars. I'll leave you now with the story of Tommy Knowles, a young lad from Durban in South Africa, who convinced his father to sign so that he could join his countrymen in the Western Front of the First World War. He never actually made it to the front, contracting influenza aboard the troop ship that he was on to Europe. He died in the same hospital on the same day as 10 other South African boys of what they called the Blue Death from the colour of their faces after asphyxiation. 8 of them were on the same ship as Tommy and are buried with him. Tommy was only 15 and is the youngest soldier buried at Brookwood Cemetery. In my story, he plays... Brookwood Military Cemetery. In my story, he plays endless games of football in the mist with his friends. I think my time is definitely up now, so I hope I've piqued your interest in Brookwood Boys. Here it is again. There's a lot more stories in there, so please check it out on Amazon. Thanks for joining me on this particular dark little hole. Please follow the Red Rabbit on social media and do subscribe. It costs you nothing and makes a big difference to the podcast. If nothing else, it encourages the ramblings of your usual hosts, Envy Peacock and Lisa Shepherd, which I've certainly always found very entertaining. You'll find my links in the show notes. I encourage anyone and everyone to visit Brookwood. And like many of my readers, I hope you can find the graves and pay their respects to the many characters there. Thank you and happy Halloween. Bye.